Hi, everyone. This is Kristen Peterson with the Hatcher Group, and thank you all so much for joining. We're going to get started and talk about how to keep cool in a crisis. Um, I lead the crisis communications team here at Hatcher, and it's a growing line of work for us, and we're really excited for you to join us and learn more about crisis communications. Today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Emily Smedley, who's going to be the webinar producer.
Hi, everyone.
And Jean McCann, who's VP of Digital Strategies at Hatcher. And Jean's going to take us on a deeper dive on some of the digital components of crisis. So just a quick note that if you have questions, we should have time at the end to take them. And you can just type them into the Q&A function in the toolbar. So just to show you the full crisis team at Hatcher Group, in addition to Jean and I, we're joined by Michael, Devin, Dawn, and Tom. And together, the six of us have decades of crisis experience. And a little bit, real briefly, of background on the Hatcher Group. We're a 35-person full-service communications firm. Our clients are major national foundations, nonprofits, and other mission-driven organizations. In addition to crisis, we do media outreach, messaging, event planning, design, pretty much anything that falls under the PR and communications umbrella. So today, again, we're going to be talking about crisis in today's digital world, and we'll be talking about how you can prepare, what to do during a crisis, and then managing the aftermath. So crisis is basically any threat to an organization's reputation. To combat this threat, there's basically two parts. First, the organization's response, which is generally operational and what they're doing within the organization to fix the situation. And the other part is communications. And that part is equally, if not more important sometimes than what's actually being done to fix the situation. So this involves how they're communicating to their employees, their stakeholders, the public, and the media. So a lot of times when people think of crisis, they think a massive product recall, an oil spill, but it could actually be, misappropriation of funds, a sexual harassment allegation. It comes in many forms. Sometimes it could be as simple as a mass email that's sent out with erroneous information to a broad group of people. And why is this important? CEOs predict a growing number of crises today, and part of that is because of all of the digital aspects that we face, which Jean will be talking about more shortly. But it's important to remember, Warren Buffett has a great quote that it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. And while every organization is at risk for a crisis, we think nonprofits and foundations sometimes have specific threats. Oftentimes, these organizations have fewer resources than for-profit companies, less staff, and they depend on donations, which are directly influenced by their reputation. So if they're not handled well, a crisis can really devastate an organization's bottom line. And Jean's going to tell us how all of this is compounded even more in today's digital world.
Thanks, Kristen. Yes, I'm sure all of us know these days that crises online are like red meat to the digital world, or maybe for the vegetarians, cupcakes. But so I thought we'd just take a moment and look at some of the numbers out there. In 2018, internet users passed the 4 billion mark. And just for reference, the whole world population is 7.7 billion. So that's a large, large chunk of people, obviously. 40,000 Google searches per second. There's 3.2 billion social media users. 81% of Americans have social media profile of some sort. 2.2 billion active monthly Facebook users. And I love this one. Every 60 seconds, 510,000 comments are posted on Facebook. 500 million tweets every single day. So the takeaway is there's lots of people on the internet, and what this means is for any crisis, there will definitely be a digital component, whether or not that crisis has originated on the internet. You need to include digital in your planning and responding, because it might not start out online, but it's probably going to end up there. So we'll be giving you some tips throughout the presentation on ways to make sure you're fully prepared for a crisis on the digital front.
Oops, sorry about that. So we came up with an acronym at Hatcher called CALM. So you want to go from crisis to calm, which is creating a plan, activating a plan, figuring out what works, and then taking that and using it to make a new plan. So as Jean mentioned, with all of the digital aspects facing us today, creating a plan is so important. Some estimates say that the typical time to respond to a crisis is just 15 minutes. So leaders have to act quickly to determine and implement the right response. And that response has to be the right message, the right tone, to the right audience, over the right channels. And sometimes that can need to be done, again, in as little as 15 minutes. So that's why we really encourage our clients to have a crisis communication plan in place before a crisis arrives. And just a few steps that will help you prepare. Even if you can't do a plan right now, you could figure out who's on the crisis team and what are their roles. Prepare a checklist. Look at digital security steps and set up social media listening. And we'll talk to you about each one of these in a little bit more detail. So establishing the crisis team and assigning roles, you really want to have the right people at the table. Again, crises require thoughtful decisions, and speed is of the essence. So you don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, because that will slow down your speed. So you want a small team for the crisis team. And a lot of times with nonprofits, this is the ED. If you have legal counsel, you'd want them on there. If you have communication staff, you'd want the head of the communication staff. But every organization and every crisis is different. So if you're managing a scandal that involves an employee, you would probably want your human resources person on the team. So, but it's really good to think through that ahead of time, and then also to decide on the key roles. Who's running your social media? You don't want a new employee handling that. You want someone trusted who really knows the organization. You want to define the stakeholder roles. So who's doing what when the crisis hits? In addition to social media, who's the spokesperson? Who's fielding the media calls? And decide who from your organization needs to review any statements before you put them out to the media ahead of time. Do you need to notify your board? If so, can you quickly reach them if a crisis strikes at 6 a.m. on a Sunday? Do you have their phone numbers and contact information? Next, developing a checklist. So just like a pilot and a flight crew needs a pre-flight checklist, you want to make sure everything is covered before you take off, before the crisis strikes. So it's really important in the heat of the moment to have a checklist to go through, because you're probably going to have a little bit of a cloudy brain. You want to confirm the facts, gather the who, what, why, where of the situation, notify stakeholders. This would be people that are key to the organization, inside and outside of the organization, and that includes, obviously, employees. And we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of including employees later on in the webinar. You also want to prepare a summary statement, and this is what you will put out to the media. And we actually encourage our clients to do this ahead of time. You could actually think through you'll never be able to think through everything, but you could think through some of the most potentially damaging risk scenarios that could happen to your organization and prepare some statements ahead of time. And this way you can save time in the event of the crisis. Maybe you could have your legal counsel and your ED look at them ahead of time, and then should anything occur, you're just more so filling in the blanks. You also want to prepare talking points. Obviously, you're going to be responding to the media. We recommend you keep a media log of callers and questions, and then continuing to update the media as the situation develops, which, again, we'll be talking about more.
And I think we also wanted to add to this checklist is maybe don't forget to check what's automatically scheduled on your social media channels to go out. I would put that on that checklist as well.
Yeah, great point. So if you have an auto post scheduled on social media that is talking about a fundraiser event in the midst of something tragic happening externally, it can look like you're out of touch. So making sure to cancel those auto posts.
And I think something we should all be doing more of on both our personal accounts and our organizational accounts is increasing our security. And yet, so few of us do this. I know I have to keep, reminding myself to do this, as well as reminding our clients to do it. But here are a few things you can do right now before the crisis hits that aren't too time sucky. For instance, safely storing and sharing your passwords. You can use a service like LastPass, which is a free online service that's super secure to store all of your passwords. Of course, then you've got to make sure you kept the password to that in a very secure place so you don't lose access to it. But we hear over and over again from clients how many people can't put their hands on passwords, which isn't usually too big of a problem if you're not in the middle of a crisis where you're trying to get access to your social accounts quickly. So something very simple you can do right away. Know who your admins are. You should be able to tell me who is the admin for your Facebook page. And it's a really good idea to have more than one admin. For some digital platforms, you just need a login and a password. But others, like Facebook, are tied to a personal account. So it's really important to know who those people are, make sure they don't have sole access. We have had a few clients who have had to create totally new Facebook pages because they didn't know who their admins were. Those people had left the organization. They couldn't be contacted. So that's a problem because they lost all of those fans that they had built up on those pages over the years. Another thing is really smart to do is implement two-factor authentication on all of your digital accounts. So if you have Gmail accounts, special Google accounts that you use with YouTube or other things, for instance, but also certainly Facebook and Twitter, enable this two-factor authentication. It sends a passcode to your phone or to your designated email before allowing access. Really simple to do, kind of annoying, but it will keep you safer in the long term. And then come up with a transfer strategy for employees who are managing these accounts. So when the employee who set up that Facebook page leaves, you know that that access to the page doesn't leave with him or her. So the risk of former employees, for me, is not so much sabotage. That's rare that happens, but it's more the lack of access. And Kristen, I think you have a good story about this access to passwords, where it kind of really mattered a whole lot.
Yeah. So about this time last year, probably a lot of you recall the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency accidentally sent an emergency missile alert to residents and visitors of Hawaii that said, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek shelter immediately, this is not a drill. Only it was a drill. So there were a lot of very terrified residents and visitors. And unfortunately, the governor's Twitter account was completely silent for 17 minutes. So this obviously made the Washington Post, it made probably international news. But the reason was because he didn't know his Twitter account logons or the password. So,
and he admitted this. He admitted this in the after report on the whole thing. That was
right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, definitely an extreme example of what could go wrong, but one to note.
So another thing we recommend folks do is set up some kind of social media listening, and not just for mentions of your organization name, but also for other things. For instance, you may have campaigns, special campaign names, or other branded initiatives or hashtags. You might want to set up social media listening for your ED, for instance, or if there are other VIPs within your organization or on your organization board, and you want to know what people are saying about these people. So you can buy kind of expensive services to track all of this stuff for you, or you can set up some free Google alerts. They're not perfect; they're not going to catch everything, but they can definitely do some of the job of keeping you informed of who is saying what. Some other services that are inexpensive, we like a service called TweetReach, which can track hashtags or brand names or people's names. It can also track things like who's talking about particular news articles. And there's another service called BuzzSumo, which I believe also has a free version. But just to spend a little time, at least set up those Google alerts for the main assets, your main branded assets.
So next up, activating the plan. So a crisis strikes, what do you do? Hopefully not this, but instead, here are 4 things that we recommend you do when a crisis does occur. You want to get ahead of the story internally and externally, engage your digital response strategy, prepare the spokesperson, and then really own the messaging. So getting ahead of the story, again, the need for speed. First, you need to tell your employees the situation, let them know what's going on, because when they have the knowledge and the tools, they can really be powerful advocates. They can spread the message amongst their peers about what's going on and be part of the overall crisis strategy. They also need to understand their boundaries so that, if somebody a media reporter is calling, they know who to give the questions to, who to refer the reporters to, but it's really good to keep them informed. And a great way to do this is a message from the ED. You can send talking points to key employees, but just know that any email is likely to become public. So as you're crafting those messages, be aware that it could end up public. So keep that in mind as you're deciding what to say. And the next part of getting ahead of the story is externally. Even if you don't have all the facts, quickly provide an initial statement. It could just say, we're aware of the situation, we're looking into it, we'll get back to you with regular updates. But you need to start talking to the media. You need to also remember to use social media. So as we've mentioned, stopping your scheduled posts and using your accounts as another tool to communicate your crisis response. So one great example of this is a tragic happening that happened in Maryland here. In 2014, there was a shooting at the Howard County Mall that left 3 people dead. The Howard County Public Information Officer did an amazing job, though, of keeping the people informed via social media. She really established herself as the authority. She provided clear and continuous updates. So even if she didn't have an update, she would tweet, still waiting on an update, we'll get back to you in half an hour, but there was never silence from her. And the media and the public really saw her as the source of information. Everybody was going there to get the information from their Twitter account.
And yeah, I think she was also a great example of someone using social media who didn't have all the answers, but she was using social to get her whatever information she did have out. So she really became the trusted source, the go-to source.
Yeah. So again, just making sure that during a crisis, you're providing continuous updates because any vacuum will be filled. And here's an example of that. Many of you may recall in 2012, the Susan G. Komen crisis. A lot of people say this is one of the biggest crises to occur this decade. And what happened was they stopped funding Planned Parenthood. They let Planned Parenthood know that, but they didn't let anybody else know that. So Planned Parenthood started getting the word out to their supporters, and there was a huge public outcry. And you can see some of the social media posts that were posted online at the time. And Susan G. Komen just remained silent. You can see at the bottom left, someone saying, just crickets over there at Komen. And this was over $700,000 of funding. But Komen ended up losing $77 million in funding that year, whereas Planned Parenthood used this opportunity to raise $3 million in 3 days. So crises can be, you know, an opportunity for good or for failure.
Right, and a good example there of what that can happen if you go radio silent. It's just the potential for damage is way more than if you came out with some kind of statement.
Right, because no response is just not an option anymore.
So here's some things on the digital side that you want to just be paying attention to. We've already mentioned canceling the auto posts. Also, look at your digital advertising. A lot of times we're running boosted posts, or we may be running Google AdWords campaigns. You just want to either double check the messages on those to be on the safe side. Just go ahead and pause them until you're sure you're out of the woods. The question about what platform to respond, what's best to respond on. You want to definitely, if the crisis originated online, you want to definitely respond on the same platform where it originated. And we have an example of this. The natural foods manufacturer Kashi faced accusations a while back that their soy products were genetically modified and had pesticides and carcinogens and all this stuff. The story went viral on Facebook, but Kashi responded with a video on YouTube instead of responding on Facebook. So that video got no traction. It would have been much better to do a live streaming video response on their Facebook page. In general, though, you should respond on numerous platforms, not just one. I like to talk about this rule of 3, which is around comments and how much you should get into it with somebody who's leaving a critical comment on your Facebook page. Usually it's on Facebook. You know, they make the comment, you reply, they reply back, you reply again. You know, by the 3rd time that you're replying, it's now less of a conversation and more of an argument, generally. So that leads to the next point, which is, you know, take it offline as quickly as possible. You want to move those critical people offline into your email. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but really that's much better than having them on a public platform arguing with you or disparaging your organization. So I would get those people offline as quickly as possible. Either give them a phone number or an email and offer to follow up with them that way. I know Kristen's already mentioned keeping employees informed. Super important, because don't forget, people can get to your employees numerous ways. It's super easy, for instance, on LinkedIn to go and find everybody who works at the Hatcher Group, and reporters can message those people. And you want to equip your employees with as much information as possible so they don't make any missteps. And also, you just don't want, you know, you don't want the public to have more information than your employees have. So make sure you keep them informed. We all know we're never going to say no comment, because that just doesn't work. I like to use this next example of Starbucks. You all remember, I guess it was a couple of years ago now, 2 African-American men were arrested in a Philadelphia Starbucks for asking to use the restroom before they bought anything. They were waiting for a friend. And there was a huge outcry, rightly so. And after a couple of days, Starbucks' response was to close all of its stores for a day of diversity training. And that was really a textbook case in how to acknowledge and respond to a crisis. But the thing is, they almost got as much flack for closing their stores as they did for the initial incident, which also goes to illustrate that when you're in the middle of a crisis, you don't really know that it's the middle. Like you don't know where you don't know where the end is. So they had we threw up some examples here of the kinds of comments they were getting. They were inundated with people saying, "Oh, now there's going to be homeless hanging out in your stores. I'm not coming anymore. You've lost my business. We're all going to be sitting around singing Kumbaya." Anyway, they got a lot of flack for doing this, and you can see from their responses there, they had very measured responses. They did not get into arguments with people. They told Susan, "Sorry to see you go. We feel we have work to do." And I think the way they handled the sort of after crisis was really textbook again. They stayed calm. They stayed true to their beliefs. Whoever also was running their social media was clearly a very trusted employee. This was not somebody who had to like go get the response vetted before they posted it. They were someone, whoever, maybe it was a team of people, they were replying in real time, and I thought they did a really spectacular job. So great example there.
Great. So next up, you want to prepare the spokesperson. And I should say that ideally you'll have done this far ahead of the crisis through spokesperson training, but you also want to prepare them with the facts of the crisis. And as a general rule, you don't want to start with the executive director as the primary spokesperson. That might be a little surprising, but once you make them visible to and available to the media, reporters will expect to gain access to them all the time, and obviously the ED is going to be very busy making decisions. So you want to free them up to be able to focus on that aspect of the crisis. Also, oftentimes they're expected to know everything. So in the beginning stages of a crisis, if they can't answer questions, it's not going to be ideal. So instead, you want to start with somebody who's typically a leadership team member from communications or PR, if that's possible within your organization. One client example, they were considering using their head of development and marketing for an allegation they were facing, and we recommended that they don't do that. Their situation was a little unique, that they had someone who headed up both marketing and development and fundraising. And we encourage them not to do that, just because you really don't want someone to be the face of the crisis that's talking about, a misappropriation of funds or an accounting error. And just one other note, you should use the executive director when it's something very tragic, though. So I'm kind of going back on that. But if, heaven forbid, it's the death of an employee, in those instances, you would use the head of the organization. But it's just good to kind of each crisis, prepare a spokesperson and then look at the crisis to see what's the best option for that situation. So next, it's really important to own the crisis. If you are wrong, you want to apologize quickly and let the public know you're taking concrete steps to make sure this doesn't happen again. And one example of this is Kentucky Fried Chicken. They had a supply chain error, and a lot of their British stores ended up not having chicken. So they took out ads, and under the ad, it said in big red letters, "We're sorry." You can see they used a little humor to rearrange KFC, and I'll let you fill in the blank for what they were going for there. But
very clever.
Yeah, they really went after it, spent money on ads, and it ended up in their favor. People loved it. They thought it was funny. They recognized that they were holding themselves accountable, and this actually helps their sales in the long run. But it's important to remember that, you can be funny in certain situations and not others.
And this is another great example. This is the American Red Cross. I'm sure you've heard of other situations where this has happened, where somebody thought they were posting to their personal account, only, they were actually posting on their organization's account. It's ridiculously easy to do this, especially if you're using the Twitter app on your phone, where you have to switch between accounts. One reason I don't ever do that anymore, I just won't do it. I like to actually, to safeguard against this problem, I recommend just signing in and out. If you're running multiple accounts, and maybe most of you are not doing that, but you may have your personal account and your organization account. So here, what happened is this dude was, I'm assuming it's a dude, how sexist of me, but saying Ryan found 2 more bottles of 4 bottle packs of Dogfish Head Midas Touch beer. When we drink, we do it right, getting slizzard. Obviously not a message the American Red Cross really wanted to get out there, but it went out on this account, and it stayed up for about an hour until the social media director at the Red Cross realized this had happened and took it down. But we really love the way the Red Cross responded to this by putting up this post. We've deleted the rogue tweet, but rest assured the Red Cross is sober and we've confiscated the keys. Kind of funny, fun. You know, this generated, the whole thing generated a ton of publicity for the Red Cross, but in a good way, actually, because they managed to respond to it in a humorous way. Now, obviously, if this was some very serious event going on, they wouldn't have been able to respond with humor, but luckily there was nothing, no life-threatening challenges or disasters at the moment. So I guess the takeaway for that, Kristen, is use humor only if you are sure the situation warrants it.
Right. Yeah, the next situation that we're going to talk about, you wouldn't want to use humor. Most of you probably recall the United crisis from 2017, where a video emerged of a passenger and he was being forcibly dragged off of the flight. In response, the United CEO he initially apologized, but it was seen as a little bit insincere. He said he apologized for having to reaccommodate these customers. And you can see in the next example of a response on social media, someone saying using reaccommodate to describe this is straight out of a sci-fi nightmare. So people did not feel like they were being authentic or taking responsibility for what had happened. And then going back to my point from earlier of making sure you know that when you're sending talking points to employees that they can end up in the media, the CEO released a letter to employees, and in it he offered his support for his staffers, but he also called the customer disruptive and belligerent, and that really did nothing to help them in this situation. So you can see the damage was done, their stocks plummeted, and they really took a hit for a long time after that.
And one of the lessons, well, there's so many lessons with this, but one of them is that assume everything you send on email to your employees is going to be public at some point. Like, right. You shouldn't be sending, sensitive information or using sensitive words in an email. I think, God, I hope we all know that lesson by now. But and I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. That's awesome. Keep them coming. We will get into those at the end. But one good way to make sure you're keeping your employees as informed and your volunteers as informed as you are the public is to maybe do an FAQ around the crisis that you post online and just update it as information becomes available, and then make sure you share that link with everyone. That's one way to do it.
Yes, that's a great tip. So then, just wrapping up, just remember, as Jean said, it ain't over till it's over. You never really know when a crisis is finished. So continue to manage the aftermath. Oftentimes, there's a swell of emotions and even more public scrutiny about how you handle things after the initial crisis is over. So you want to continue listening on social media, monitoring the media, and responding accordingly. One example of this is Susan G. Komen, which I talked about earlier, after they went through the whole ordeal with Planned Parenthood, people started really looking into how they were spending their money, and they faced a second crisis of how they were allocating their funds.
Yeah, and same with Starbucks, who had the crisis after the crisis. You know, again, when you're in the middle of it, you don't know that it's the middle. You may not know for some time when it's actually over.
Right. So keep paying attention to what's going on in the media.
So the next step is, learning what worked, and this is just, documenting and analyzing as much of what your response has been and what the response has been to you as you go along. Things like, keeping copies of what's gone out on social media as much as possible. Like, you probably can't do it if you have something enormous like the Starbucks example, but usually we're not facing that sort of national attention. But documenting what messages you put out, what the response was to those, making copies of all your email communications, for instance. Doing something like analyzing your website traffic patterns. Like, did your website handle the increased load? You want to know what happened. Were people getting shut out of the website, maybe because there was too much traffic? Think about where the crisis broke and when and how did it spread, and just, take note of all of these things. How did your internal notifications work? Were you able to get your employees up to speed quickly and your volunteers up to speed quickly? Were there gaps in there in the flow of information? How did customers or your constituents respond, and how did they feel informed enough? You may even want to do an informal survey, online survey, with employees, maybe with volunteers, maybe with your constituents, and just get some feedback on how did we do? What could we do better? What worked? What didn't work? And the best time to make your new plan is immediately after you've gone through a crisis. Everything's fresh in your mind. You have what worked, what didn't work. Take your lessons learned. Think through what went well, what you wish you'd done differently. I like to always advise people to be pretty critical, be brutal in this phase where you're evaluating what could have gone better. You don't want to sugarcoat things here. And then create your new plan, implementing or incorporating what you've learned. So the next time a crisis strikes, you'll be able to say, along with Olivia, it's handled.
Yeah, we had to do a Olivia Pope.
Had to get her in there.
Slide in here. So yes, the main takeaways are, again, have a plan in place before you need it. Once the crisis strikes, make sure to get ahead of the story and really own it. Throughout all of this, planning, during, after, don't neglect digital, and then debrief. So as Jean said, you can do it the next crisis, you'll be able to handle better, faster, smarter. And now we're going to open up the questions. I did think, Jean, before we take questions from the audience, one thing I was reminded of during the presentation, you had an example of a crisis around McDonald's hashtag.
Yes. So, yeah, this is an example of a hashtag turning into a crisis. They call it hashtag hijacking. People may be familiar with this, but McDonald's, the fast food emporium, decided they were going to generate some user interaction by asking people to share their hashtag McD stories. And they put this out there, and pretty much instantly it went south. The hashtag became the bash tag, with people posting things like, I used to work at McDonald's, the McD stories I could tell you would raise your hair. I ate a McFish and I vomited. I'm quit going to McDonald's and lost 50 pounds. McD stories. Like, it just spiraled out of control, so they tried to shut it down very quickly. I guess the lesson there is be super careful if you want to do something like this where you're going to put your brand name out there in some sort of hashtag fashion, and try to imagine how people could misuse it, because there've been a lot of these stories. That's just one fairly recent, very funny example. Be careful of hashtags.
Thank you.
We have a few questions come in. This first one from Michael Cross Barnett about, he says they're a complex organization with dozens of direct employees, many volunteers, 100 fiscal sponsored projects. How can we make sure everyone stays on message in a crisis?
Great question. And Michael, for your organization, again, so important to get ahead of it with a plan, and just figure out what notification systems you do have, how you typically communicate with all of those stakeholders, and having something ready to go across all of those notification systems should a crisis occur. Jean talked about having an online FAQ that people can look at, sending talking points, but again, just remembering that this will be public, which is fine. If you're just sharing facts, then there's nothing wrong with that. But just remembering that as you're communicating to all of these stakeholders.
And the truth is, you're not gonna. It's not gonna be perfect, especially with a huge organization like that. You just have to do the best you can, though. If you take some of these steps that we've talked about, it should go a long way to helping to keep all your constituencies informed. But it's not going to be 100% perfect. Okay, here's a question from Jasmine Estes on asking for clarification around whether the ED or the CEO should comment on all crisis situations at some point, even if they aren't the primary spokesperson.
Yes, great question. So they should. We're not saying that you don't want them to be the author of statements that you're putting out to the media, but if you're in a situation where somebody needs to be talking on camera, over social media, however, to the media, that's when you don't want to initially use the ED. But you're right, you do want them to be authoring some of the statements, and still weighing in at some point.
And it's going to depend on the situation, of course, what that point is, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's hard to give blanket recommendations up front. But yeah, I think that's wise advice. You don't want to put your valuable asset out there instantly, generally.
Right, unless it's something very tragic, and then
yes,
and then you should.
And then you should, unless they're head of United Airlines, and then you shouldn't, because they don't know what they're doing. Believe they have a way you can reply as the organization to negative reviews. I know, for instance, on Yelp, you can do that with organizations when they get negative comments. I'm pretty sure there is a way to respond within Glassdoor's accepted terms of service. Yeah, I mean, that's the risk for all these sort of online public rating system. I mean, another thing you could try to do is, if you could figure out who the person was, is try to talk to them, but proceed with caution on that as well. Kristen, did you have a suggestion?
No, just that, in the case of Glassdoor, I think people also know as they're reading those that obviously if someone left, they probably left for a reason and might not be speaking for everyone. But,
right. Right. Yeah.
And I also see Devin had a question about a spokesperson as well. And these are great questions. How do you decide who should be your organization's spokesperson? And that's, again, really important to think through ahead of time. As we mentioned, and ideally you really want to have a spokesperson and a backup spokesperson. Just have two people trained in case one person is unavailable. but you really want them to obviously be poised and reflect the culture of the organization, but they should also have a deep understanding of the organization. So somebody who's been there for a while, they should have the confidence of top management, obviously, and be able to speak in everyday language to be able to really reach all audiences.
But maybe you spend some time with, like, you know, a few key people, getting them some media training. Never a bad idea.
Yep, and we've done that that's a great point, Jean. We've done that for clients where a couple of people get media trained, and then through that emerges somebody who's especially skilled at it, and whether they are happy about it or not, become the spokesperson.
The designated driver.
Yep.
Yeah, but awesome question. And it looks like we've got another question. How can the Hatcher Group help nonprofits if they find themselves in the middle of a crisis? I would hope you come to us before a crisis erupts, but we've definitely had people come to us in the middle of one. And Kristen, maybe you can talk more about the kinds of things we can do for folks.
Yeah, sure. So, so as Jean said, we've had clients come to us to develop a plan ahead of time, also when they're in the thick of a crisis and need help communicating and responding. As we were just mentioning, we do spokesperson training. And we also help with crisis plan development, in the middle of the crisis, helping with strategic counsel of how to respond, and then helping with the notification to stakeholders and monitoring the media and social media. So basically all of the parts of crisis communications, we are here to help. Is that all the questions?
I think so. I think that is it. But of course, you've got our emails up there on the screen, so feel free to follow up with questions to either of us.
Yes, and thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate you taking the time. And we'll also be posting a PDF of this presentation on thehatchergroup.com. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.